Hello, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sarah Edens, a finance coach, author, and wealth mindset researcher, and I'm so happy you chose to join me today. We are talking about financial news updates for the last 2 weeks. So we're kind of in the middle of January right now, and it's been a pretty wild start to the year so far. So let's talk about some of the things that have been happening in the markets, in the financial sector, in the economy, and it's just all the things that you kind of need to know here for the first 2 weeks of January. So number one is government shutdown deja vu. Will they? Won't they? I feel like at this point we could probably get a coin and just, do a coin toss, and heads they shut it down and tails they keep it open, and just see. I feel like that would be about as accurate right now as it tends to get. I think right now they're trying to pass a continuing resolution that would get us through slightly longer than the current deadline to shut down on January 19th. And by the time you're watching this video, they may have already gotten that sorted out. So we shall see what happens. But they've got two kind of debt cliffhangers here. They've got one on January 19th and another one coming up on February 2nd. And it is just really always amazes me, right? How the politicians can manage to take something that should be as mundane housekeeping as passing the national budget, and they manage to turn it into an outright, war. So it just ends up being something that is highly stressful for everyone who's on the federal payroll. I know we're military families, so every time this happens, I am there trying to figure out, should I plan to not be paid for a while, or should we plan for there to be our salary coming in as usual? So it gets super stressful for us. I'm sure it's the same way for you if you're a federal employee, military family, and so forth. So it's just one of these things that if you're directly affected by it, it becomes super stressful every time they keep threatening to shut the government down. So it would be great if they would stop doing this. It's all thanks to a very archaic old law that you can find out about in my government shutdown series, which I will link to in the description, that they can even do these government shutdowns in the first place. It's like a super old law that somebody decided to interpret, federal judge decided to interpret in a way that allowed them to shut the government down if they hadn't passed a budget and so forth. So lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have started using this as an opportunity to push their agendas through, which is no way to run a country. You wouldn't run a company or a household this way. So it's astonishing that the politicians even try running their federal budget this way. But anyway, that's kind of on my radar, is those January 19th and then February 2nd fiscal cliff things. They always tended to be these kind of nail-biting cliffhangers, and then eventually they tend to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government open while they continue to work things out on the budget, just because there's usually not a lot of actual consensus from parties on either side of the aisle to actually shut things down, because it's so expensive for the government, it's so unpopular with voters, and we are coming into an election year. So it's just one of those things that if you're in a position where you and your family are affected by it, and that's your livelihood that they're messing around with, it gets highly stressful. So for me, I tend to lean pessimistic towards whether or not they can get these passed, and just plan on every time that they've got a fiscal cliff that we may be going for a couple of weeks without pay, which they always catch us up on later. Once they've reopened, we do get that back pay. But for a lot of federal contractors, for example, they're not going to get back pay. They just get furloughed, and then that's a lot of lost wages in there. So it just ends up being a real headache for everyone that is on the federal payroll. So we'll see what happens on the 19th and the 2nd. But like I said, I tend to lean pretty pessimistic on this, just because it's easier for me to plan that we won't get paid than to be planning on that money being there and need it, and then have them shut it down after all and be in between pay periods that way, which is just less stressful to just plan for them to not get their act together by those deadlines. So we'll see what happens, but that's on my radar. Number two is the financial markets are rebounding after a pretty rough start to 2024. So they definitely went through quite a downtick over the first 2 weeks of January, and then they rallied and started to close higher on Monday of this week than they've done over the past 2 weeks. The S&P 500 and the NASDAQ were both up higher than they'd been. The Dow also ended higher despite Boeing's latest fiasco with their 737 MAX 9 fuselage door plug blowout, which if you haven't seen this image already, you have probably not been watching the news, because this image has been absolutely viral. And I don't think that anybody who's flying in the future is going to be fighting for the window seat anymore. So I I certainly will be opting for an aisle seat next time I fly, and preferably steering clear of Boeing 737 MAX 9s just because they've had so many issues, and the FAA has found many other issues with them since many of these planes were grounded since this issue. On a side note, I would expect Apple to be having a pretty decent quarter going forward because they have the best marketing opportunity on their hands that they've had in a long time, in the sense that you can apparently drop one of the new iPhones from 16,000 feet and it lands completely unscathed and still in working order. Some people have said perhaps this is because it was in a case, but it's still quite impressive feat. Even if the case was really good, it's fantastic that your phone can fall from that kind of a height and still be in good working order. So that is something that's quite interesting. We'll see with the stock markets if they keep this rally up. Now, if you've been watching my Recession Watch series, which I will link to in the description, you know that from everything I'm seeing, we will most likely be having an economic downturn, which would also translate into a stock market downturn here in the next 12 to 18 months. So we'll see what happens with that. One of the things, too, that we're watching is this is an election year. Typically, the stock market tends to perform pretty well in the 6 months leading up to an election year, and then in the time from when that year begins and the election itself, which is coming up here in November. So we'll be seeing here what's going to kind of play out with how much the election is also going to affect the markets versus everything I talked about in the Recession Watch series will affect the markets. So just something to keep an eye on there. And if you haven't already caught up on my Recession Watch series, that's in the description. Okay, number 3 of news here for the first 2 weeks of January. Tax season is coming up, with January 29th, the first day that U.S. taxpayers can start filing for fiscal year 2023 income tax. So the deadline, of course, being April 15th. Now, you may do this tax filing yourself. You may have your CPA do it or use a tax filing service. But regardless of who you use, this may be a good year to get your tax filing in earlier in the year rather than waiting up until April, because with these fiscal cliffs like we've talked about, and even if they get continuing resolutions through, all that means is we'll have fiscal cliffs probably in March. So if they do actually have a government shutdown sometime this winter or this spring, it will obviously affect their ability to process tax returns because the IRS is federal employees. So unless they make them continue to show up for work without pay, which I guess is possible, there could be some real interruptions in tax returns here over the next couple of months. So maybe a good year to get your taxes in a little bit early. Fourth thing that I'm watching here in the news is that despite continuing high prices on basically everything, even though inflation is coming down nicely, American consumers took the go big or go home approach to their holiday shopping this year. So I'll put an interesting quote on screen from one of the former chairs of the FDIC talking about the situation that we're in now with the national debt and with American consumer debt. And I'm going to put that up on the screen. This is from Sheila Bair, who, like I said, is one of the former chairs of the FDIC. She says, not good. This is from January 9th. Consumer credit exploding to over $5 trillion in November, while revolving credit, mostly credit cards, near $1.3 trillion. And $5 trillion, by the way, is a record. We're going to look at a chart here in a minute of that. We obsess over GDP, unemployment, labor participation, etc., as predictors of recession, but rising consumer debt levels have also portended economic downturns. Hope this is a pre-holiday blip and consumers can pay it off. So I thought that was really interesting. Let me put another chart up here too. This is the consumer credit outstanding, and you can see how much it has just taken off here in the last couple of years. We are now at $5 trillion of total American household consumer debt is where that is at the moment. So that was really something to look at. Let's look at another thing too. This was from Deloitte with some of the research that they do, and they've got some projections, which I think that they actually outstripped their projections, that people were going to holiday like it's 2019, like you can see there. The average expected holiday spend was obviously higher than it was in 2019 even. And so we definitely saw that play out this holiday season where people were just really, like I said, going big or going home with their holiday spending. So that left a lot of people in credit card debt here in January. So if that's you, I have a whole series on dealing with credit card debt that I will link to in the description that you can watch if you need some help getting those balances paid off. But that definitely was something that it was just a really big retail year. I feel like maybe some of that too was what's called doom spending, where people are like, well, there might be a recession, things might get scarce again, I might lose my job, so let's just spend big, and who cares what's going to happen tomorrow, because like it's just all so unpredictable and stressful, like, you know, whatever. So some of that might have been some holiday doom spending too. So we'll see. Also not shown in those charts is the debt that would have been incurred from buy now, pay later companies. So those incur what's called phantom debt. And that is basically because it doesn't show up on people's credit scores, but it's still something that if you have a purchase that you financed through buy now, pay later, then you're still obviously paying on that now, even if you bought it last month or whatever. And so that's more overall debt to your household debt burden is kind of what those are about. So those are not reflected in these other features here. So very interesting with kind of how much cumulative household debt everybody has. And I think that is also really speaks to how much everything's costing right now too, because some of this is not just that people are like crazy spenders. It's also that if you go into any grocery store right now, any retail store across this entire country, stuff costs so much more than it used to. And even if they do put it on a holiday sale, it still costs so much more than it used to. So I think some of this might have been pent up demand of people shopping Black Friday sales, Cyber Monday sales, and holiday sales. So I think that might have also been some of it, because I know we were doing that at our house where we were holding off on some purchases to see what kind of deals we could get with Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and the Christmas sales. And we didn't actually end up buying that much stuff, but we did get some really good prices that we hadn't seen that good of sales all year. So some of that is pent up consumer demand, not just Christmas shopping, but just shopping for stuff that they were waiting to shop when it was on a better sale, which I'm a big fan of that strategy personally. Okay, what else are we looking at here? Yes, it's still January, but the spring 2024 housing market is starting already. So this is another thing that gets back to pent-up demand. And this is where people have been waiting to buy homes over the last year or so as we've seen the mortgage interest rates go up. Let's look at a chart here from Zillow of where mortgage interest rates are right now. So if you look at this, you can see that 30-year fixed as of January 10th are at 6.4%, 20-year fixed are at 6.10%, 15-year fixed are at 5.64% if you want to do a 15-year fixed. So mortgage interest rates have really started to come down nicely. Now, they're still about twice as high as they were 3 years ago, so don't get too caught up in the fact that they're better than they've been all year, because they're still relatively rather high. The other thing too, let me pull up this chart from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. This is the home price to median household income ratio. So if you look at this, this shows all the way back to 1975 of relative to people's income, median household income in the US, how much homes cost. So look at where we are now, highest ever, 7.51 times higher, times your average American's median household income that's how much more homes are costing right now. So basically, you take whatever you're making, times it by 7.5%, and that's how much more, or not 7.5%, but 7.5 times your income, and that's the average of what home prices are right now. So that's just really illustrating how hard it is to buy a home right now on very simple terms. So because home prices are so much higher than people's incomes. And so that just means that you just end up with a lot more debt that takes you a lot of time to pay off, and then saddled with those higher mortgage interest rates that we've been dealing with. It just hasn't been a great climate to buy a home in. So that's something that is interesting. Now, despite all of this, I was still seeing a lot of real estate investors and realtors who I follow on LinkedIn this week talking about how their phones are ringing off the hook with people who are ready to buy houses, and that the open houses have just been flooded with people. So it's very interesting. So if you're in this boat where you've been waiting to buy a house, My best advice to you, and you do what's the right thing for you in your situation, obviously, but if saving money and getting the best the best value for your money is your priority, then my advice to you would be to wait and let this latest craze cool off, because this is starting to rival what we saw in 2020 or 2021, excuse me, when people were starting to really flood back into the housing market after not buying homes for most of 2020. It's kind of what we're seeing again. So there's all this pent-up demand. If you're a home seller, you're trying to sell your home, this is probably a great year to sell it. But in terms of being a buyer, possibly not so much, just because you're still dealing with fairly high mortgage interest rates. You're dealing with those very inflated cost of homes. And then you're also dealing with a lot of competition from other home buyers who want the same home. So it could end up being a situation where it could be really stressful and there's a lot of competition. You could also end up with a lot of competition from cash buyers, which is always hard to compete with. Pre-qualified buyers who have their loans pre-qualified. So it just kind of depends on your specific situation. But if you're looking to get the best value for your money, I would recommend just to give it a couple of months and just see if this is just like a spike and then this cools off. It also may allow more people to put their homes on the market. If people are realizing that it's a great time to sell their house, we may see a lot more inventory come on the market as well. I know in general, inventory across the country has been pretty low. And so if there's a lot more people who suddenly decide to list their homes, that's going to provide more choices for you as well. So it just depends on kind of what your reasons are that you're buying a house. But if you're in a position where you can continue to wait, it might pay off really nicely for you to be patient, wait another 3 to 6 months and see where this all leads. And I will continue to track this for you as well. And we'll continue to look at where the housing market is in future videos like this. So stay tuned as well for that. And yes, I mean, patience is always your friend when you're looking at buying big investments, even if you're paying cash for your house. And certainly if you're looking at getting a mortgage, patience is always your friend when you're looking at getting into large amounts of debt, not to rush into it or anything. So, all right, well, that's the top financial news for the first half of January 2024. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again soon in my next video.